Alright guys, since we got this panel into the boat in the last video, the next step was to start integrating the wiring in, whether it be the existing wiring from the boat or any of the new wires that I ran, into the electrical panel. So I'm going to step through the panel and just kind of recap for those that didn't see the previous video where I kind of built this thing in the basement, recap kind of what's going on here, and then also show sort of where I ran those existing wires on this panel and kind of what everything's doing. Back in 2017, I began a full restoration of my 96 Bayliner by tearing it apart all the way down to the hull. From there, I began the rebuilding process, which included learning to fiberglass, rebuilding an engine and outdrive, learning to fair and paint, and even upholstery. Now, I've bought a 28-foot cabin cruiser, and I'm starting all over. Welcome, my name's Jared. Now get ready, because it's going to be a ship show. Alright guys, welcome back to the channel. My name is Jared, and in this episode, we are going to dive very deeply into the electrical panel install. In the previous video, like I mentioned, we got the panel installed in the boat but left it at that. It is now time to go over the full kind of system integration, including getting the AC wiring run to the panel, or from the panel to the inverter. Also going to go over how at least the mindset in terms of how I went about hooking up the DC systems and things like that. So first thing we got to do is get all the DC wiring prepped, crimped, heat shrunk, all that kind of stuff labeled. So let's get all that stuff prepped, cut to length, ready to go, crimpers ready, climb under the aft cabin area and get all that stuff terminated and hooked up. Let's go. So it's time to start hooking up all these wires and finishing this up so we can get a couple more steps closer to actually putting the house battery and powering this thing on and testing it out, which is pretty exciting. I'm going to start, there's several things that need hooked up here, but I'm going to start with these long 8-gauge wires that are hanging down here. These are existing wires in the boat. A couple of these used to run to the DC breaker panel. Another set used to run to the stereo amplifier. There's another set in here, which was the new run that I made up to the helm fuse block. So those are at least a little bit on the shorter side, but the existing DC panel and amplifier wires are like way too long and they're in my way. So I'm going to start with these just so I can cut them and get them out of here. It's going to make working in here a little bit easier. So first thing I need to do is mark their length, cut them to length, and crimp them and all that good stuff. So here we go. So I'm going to step through the panel and just kind of recap for those that didn't see the previous video where I kind of built this thing in the basement, recap kind of what's going on here, and then also show sort of where I ran those existing wires on this panel and kind of what everything's doing. All right, so gonna try and keep this as not shaky as possible, but let's kind of start down here at the bottom left. So this main battery disconnect here is going to be the disconnect for the house battery, which lives just on the other side of this bulkhead. I still need to run those two large wires once I'm done here. But the positive will connect down to this terminal here, and the negative obviously to the battery side of the shunt. So that delivers the power through this Victron Lynx Distributor, or Lynx Power In. I'm going to make a separate video on this and why I think this is not a good choice for boats. I kind of wish I knew that going into this. I kind of learned it a little bit too late and had already spent the money, so I'm kind of stuck with it. So we'll talk about what I had to do to deal with the issues that this thing has. So anyways, the power's coming in here. On the other side of this bulkhead, there will be a 400 amp Class T fuse. So that fuse will feed in here and then feed the Lynx Distributor. So the Lynx Distributor then branches off, obviously, it's kind of the point of it, into really three main things here. So starting at the bottom, we have the 4-gauge wire going to the Orion XS, which is right here. That is the DC to DC charger, 50 amp, 12 volt to 12 volt. The point of this, if you're not aware, this charges my house battery from the start battery. The reason you need to do that is because I'm charging lithium battery chemistry with a old school kind of lead acid start battery. So I don't have a external regulator on my alternator that has any smart charging capabilities. So the easiest way to do that is with this Orion XS that has the charge profiles built into the software for lithium, and you can program those parameters. So that is what this is. Coming out of that is on the bottom. That's the wire going back to the Lynx Distributor with a 60 amp circuit breaker. Now you might say, why in the world do I need a 60 amp circuit breaker there if I have a 60 amp mega fuse up there? Two reasons. And this is going to start getting into why I think the Victron Lynx Distributor is not an appropriate bus bar solution for a boat. So the first reason I put this here is I wanted an easy way from in here to be able to disconnect that circuit. If I'm working on anything in here and I want to isolate the start battery from powering back anything on this side, that is basically just acting as a switch. Now the other reason that I have this here is because, like I was getting into here, the mega fuses that are used in Victron's Lynx Distributor are, the AIC rating on them is only about 2,000 amps. The new update to the ABYC standards require branch circuits to have a, well, it depends on your battery bank size. I believe it's anything over like 340 amp hours requires a AIC rating on branch circuits of at least like 3,000 amps. So those fuses technically do not meet the ABYC standard based on my battery bank. And unfortunately, nobody makes mega fuses that have an AIC rating that high. So that is another reason that the circuit breaker is here, because this has a 6,000 amp AIC rating. So this now satisfies the circuit breaking capacity, I guess you could say, for that circuit. Again, that's feeding into the, or out of the Lynx Distributor, or I'm sorry, the Orion XS. And then this top one coming in, if you obviously you can read that, that's coming from the start battery, so that's what's feeding in and then converting the power over to the charge profile for the lithium battery bank. So that is the first circuit there. The next one up, obviously, as you can see, and based on the gigantic wires, is for the inverter. So that's just running straight over here through a service disconnect and into the inverter. It is 4-aught wire. This green one here is my ground path back from the inverter. So any DC fault current from the case, this wire needs to be at least no smaller than one size smaller than the main conductors. Now in this case, and like most people do, I just use the same 4-aught that I use for the power and ground. I put this green sleeve on it to indicate that it is a ground wire, so I didn't have to bother buying another color. So that's what that is so that's what's going on there. Now, this next one up is another situation where it actually ended up working out better this way anyway because of the multiple circuits I had. But what I did is I actually ran a power and ground wire out to two smaller bus bars, a positive and negative. This is a MRBF fuse holder. Has 3 positions. And again, the reason for that is MRBF fuses actually have a like 10,000 amp AIC rating, so significantly higher than the mega fuses, so that satisfies that requirement. and that also gave me more positions essentially to take power off of the house battery bank. So what I have up here, 2 of these are existing wires. This one here goes to the DC panel. This one here goes to a stereo amplifier. And this one here is a new wire run that goes up to a fuse block at the helm. So now I have 3 power takeoffs coming off of one circuit from the Lynx distributor. So that kind of worked out pretty nice. That's kind of the main thing that's going on here. And you'll also see this other ground coming down. This is the current return path back to the start battery circuit. It's going to the ground bus back in the engine compartment. So that's basically the ground return path tie for the DC to DC charger. That's why you see an extra ground wire coming in up here. All right, so one last thing on the DC side. One thing I wanted to mention is if you guys ever run these MRBF fuses and use smaller gauge wires, so this is 8 gauge coming in here, and they are a 5/16 stud. If you see the kind of geometry of this crimp lug, if you can see that, I don't love how these fit on the MRBF fuses because the ring on the fuse, like the contact ring, is quite a bit larger. You can see that. So what I've actually been doing in situations like this is I actually take a larger battery cable crimp lug that's 5/16, but I think this was like 2/0 or 1/0. I actually just break off you can see that, like the washer part of it, and put that down first. So you would definitely never want to do this with like a stainless steel washer. I'm using these crimp lugs because they're tin plated copper and won't cause any higher resistance. So that's what I do. It kind of helps kind of bridge that gap. So just wanted to mention that. That being said, minus missing the fuse for here, the DC side of this is basically entirely hooked up at this point. So the next thing I need to do is run the AC wiring from the AC panel, the existing shore power input stuff, down to the inverter, make those connections, and then run the AC out back up to the breaker panel. We'll do that here, and then I'll show you how we're going to do that. All right, guys, so with the electrical panel back there having all the DC wiring hooked up at this point, the next step is to run the AC wiring. So I need to get AC input from like the shore power. I need to send that back to the inverter AC input, and then the AC output from the inverter back to the electrical panel. Part of the reason I'm doing that is it has a feature called power boost. So if I only have 30 amp shore power inlet, the inverter can actually boost that power and add up to 25 more amps. So because of that, I need to go ahead and install this 8.3 wiring back to the inverter. So this will handle up to 50 amps. So technically the inverter could do 55, I think, an absolute max, but you can derate it in the software, and I have a 50 amp fuse, so I'm planning on max 50 amps. I need to get this uncoiled here, pull the electrical panel off, and then feed it back down to the electrical panel. Alright guys, so in that last clip I was getting the AC input wire, the AC output wire installed into the inverter, crimping the terminals, all that kind of stuff. And I had to pause after that because I didn't yet have the 10 gauge wire that I needed to run back to the panel for the AC input. Kind of forced me to take a day or two, and as part of that process of installing those terminals into the wires into the terminals on the Multiplus, I didn't love the way that they felt in there. Like, they were staying, but it almost felt like I could pull them out. So that forced me to go back and look at the Victron manual, and I didn't see anything in there outside of what I was doing, so I thought it was okay. Dug a little deeper and found out that this is sort of a issue of contention with the Multiplus inverters. They have spring-loaded push-in terminals, and in using boat cable, which is kind of fine-stranded tin-plated cable, you can't just push that in without any kind of ferrule. Now, some people will actually insert a screwdriver to open up that spring-loaded terminal, and in that case you can push the wire in and let go. However, again, with thin-stranded cable, you run the risk of then actually cutting and severing those wires in that cable, so that's not ideal either. So really, terminals, or ferrules rather, is the recommended approach. I installed ferrules, so I was good with that. However, what I found out is the length of the ferrule is very important. The Amazon brand ferrules I've used before. They work great. I've checked them. They are copper, tin-plated copper. However, they're relatively short. And the problem with that is as soon as that insulation hits the inside of that terminal, it prevents the ferrule from inserting any further into that pocket. And with the length ferrules I measured they were about 1/2 inch. With that length ferrule, the engagement inside of that contact in the spring-loaded terminal is very, very minimal. And you can actually, there's a guy on Solar DIY, whatever, the Will Prouse forum, he had a documented case of where that terminal actually caught fire and melted, and it was fully related to the terminals he used. They were too short. So that freaked me out and made me dig a little deeper, and what I found is there's another article by, again, I forget who, if I remember I'll link it down in the description, on sort of the proper terminals to use. So I had the thought of going on the world's greatest website, McMaster-Carr, checking there, and I found, lo and behold, 8 and 10 gauge terminals that are about 3/4 of an inch long, which is exactly what Victron recommends as the strip length. Even better, they are UL certified and plated copper, so you know that they're like legit. What I have here is my newly arrived 10 gauge cable zip tied to the 8 gauge that I had ran in that previous clip. I've since pulled it back out because I also found it's way easier to put those terminals, or I keep calling them terminals, those ferrules on now and then feed it through instead of working back there with stripping wires and all that kind of stuff. So I've got all 6 of these ferrules crimped, both the 8 and 10 gauge. If this is going to focus, I don't know. Get my face out so it focuses. So yeah, now that I have this stuff ready to go, I got to feed this back into the hole, and then we will plug these into the terminals, secure the wire, and then we can deal with the other ends up at the panel. All right, got you back here at the inverter again. Got the 2 wires run. I've actually gone ahead and already reinstalled the larger gauge AC out wire, but I just want to show you again the AC input wire. Here's my 3 terminals. Before I do that, I'm going to go ahead and tighten down this little strain relief here. I looked up the Phoenix Contact terminal block data sheet for their version of this. Phoenix Contact is like a very well-known company when it comes to industrial connectors, terminal blocks, things like that. So everybody copies them. That's why they're green. That's Phoenix Contact's color. I looked at their data sheet, and for 6 gauge wire or 4 gauge wire, which is the largest gauge these can accept, the pull-out force is no less than 100 newtons, or like 22 pounds. So quite a bit of retention force, but to make sure that that never is seen, you want to make sure you tighten down these strain reliefs, because now no matter how hard you pull on this, that force doesn't transfer to this terminal block. Okay, that being said, what I am doing here is making basically a service loop, so any vibration and things like that won't easily transfer to that connection. Okay, so if you can see this terminal now, hopefully this is all in focus. Looks like it is. Starting with the neutral marked here, N. We push that in this opening. Now I'm making sure that this square ferrule is going in square. Just push like that as far as it'll go. Okay, and then pull, not coming out. Okay, rinse and repeat. that is the AC in and the AC out. Now the Victron Multiplus II has an AC out too, which I'm not going to be utilizing. So I just need to go through then and strain relief these AC wires to the panel, make sure they're not flopping around on the boat, and we will be done back here with the inverter for now. And then we'll go take care of the wiring at the other side of the panel. All right, guys, I am up at the electrical panel. I have the breaker panel just kind of hanging down here out of the way right now, and my 2 wires from the inverter I got here. I got the 10 gauge and 8 gauge. So first thing I need to do is, obviously I measured and ordered just to make sure a little more than I needed on the 8 gauge. Probably went a little overboard. Might have about 6 feet too much. Anyways, I need to cut this to length. So nothing scientific here. I think I'm just gonna cut it right about there. So now we need to talk about how this wiring is going to work. So right here are my 2 existing shore power breakers. I have 2 30 amp inputs to the boat. One shore power number shore 2 here. This was solely dedicated to running air conditioning. Shore power 1, however, the way this was wired previously was kind of weird. I stared at the back of this trying to figure out what in the world was going on. And one other part that we didn't talk about yet is the drum switch. So this drum switch mounts right here, and I don't have the faceplate here, but basically it says shore and generator. So it's the selector switch. There's an off position as well. Now, when I was going through how this was wired, it was very confusing to me because the wiring was going directly from the shore power inlet to the drum switch, from the drum switch to the breakers. It seemed odd to me. It seemed like the breaker should be the absolute first thing on the circuit, especially with the reverse polarity indicators, all that kind of stuff. I looked it up and sure enough, that's the way it's supposed to be. I completely disconnected all the wires from this drum switch and immediately started panicking because I realized there's a lot of terminals on here and it wasn't clear to what each one of them goes to. Did a little bit of research online. Not finding a lot of good info, so I basically just did it the old-fashioned way, sat down with a multimeter, turned the knob, and measured what contacts go to what. I ended up trying to wrap my head around what in the world was going on and why they had these jumper wires in here, and most boats only have 2 sections. This extra section isn't usually there. It's usually just these 2, and that was confusing me, so again, sat down kind of with a piece of paper in front of me and started laying it out. I'll throw the diagram up on the screen here, and it kind of makes sense what they had before, but it was a little bit different, again, mostly because the breakers were after the switch. So I will be fixing that, feeding both breakers into the switch. So shore power off and generator, that control will work for both. Okay, enough talking. So let's get these cables stripped, expose the interconductors, and crimp some terminals on, and then we will start reassembling the drum switch and wiring into the breakers. Yeah. Ooh, I am sweating. It's hot in here. All right, guys, that is going to do it for this video. It's getting to be too long for me to keep going with this one, so I think this is going to be a good spot to wrap up. In the next video, my plan is to buckle up the last little bit of wiring at the AC panel here. I ran into a little bit of a hiccup with the breaker that I bought, so I got to figure that out. We'll save that for the next video. But as long as I'm able to straighten that out and figure out a solution, in theory, in the next video, I will get that buttoned up, and then we should be able to go ahead and test the AC system at least, if not the DC system. So that's going to be a lot of fun. Hopefully, knock on wood, no boat fires, any of that kind of stuff. Don't want to let the magic smoke out anything. So that's going to take a good sit down and really think about if there's anything I'm missing. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to test everything because like the toilet's not rebuilt yet. I don't have the bilge pumps in, but like the cabin lighting and just kind of miscellaneous stuff, I can check that out at least. So that'll be pretty fun. And then we can get the shore power inlet reinstalled as well. So yeah. Anyways, like I said, that's going to do it for this one, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Share the video. Leave a comment. All that good stuff. Call your grandmother. Tell your lover. Whatever. But anyways, thank you guys so much. And until the next one, thanks for watching.